We are going to talk about networked media. And as I just said, I put these slides together in the last hour with Jeff. He'll be around to help with Q&A as well, since I'm going to try to keep this to half the time, maybe a little more, since like Shebnam, I also tend to run long. But I think this will be an interesting mixture of applied and sort of theory. I'm a PhD research scientist, so I get a little bit nerdy, but I'm going to tether it to reality. So we're going to start by revisiting this concept of media. And so I particularly like what this framing of media as basically that which carries human communication beyond short range of voice. So like we talk to each other, but here we're talking via the Jitsi and these communication networks, but sort of the extent to which we've, extended the range of human. What was that? Hello?
I think that was an accident. Carry on.
No worries. So the extent to which we can extend our voice, our communication beyond the scope of our immediate space and time, right? So like there's long range communication through like transporting the information so that I'm talking to people all over the world, but there's also this degree of permanence of like sort of temporal carrying of that communication. And so we're actually going to be thinking about media in this very like general sense of carrying communication. And that means we express ourselves and we create things and people then later consume them. And so this example is going all the way back to cave painting, all the way up to a sort of our modern, quote unquote, networked media, social media, et cetera, by way of, for example, a printing press, which actually, you first start mass producing words and books and pictures. They can spread out both in space and in time through that media. Brief history, right? This is just like some clip art from the internet. There were some really involved academic ones, and there's some relatively, sort of, like I said, clip arty things. But again, this idea that this is something that's been evolving for a long time. Like we as humans, we want to express ourselves. We want to create things. And it can be anything from monumental architecture, like we are still experiencing the expression of the pyramids and other things that were created by humans that expressed some meaning to them and maybe don't even have the same meaning to us as the original creators. But this idea here that sort of media is that which carries our expression beyond us. And today we have this sort of crypto universe emerging where we're expressing ourselves in all sorts of interesting ways. In particular, we're even, individually or in small groups designing and manifesting economic forms. And then like through those expressions, we're continuing to, communicate with each other or even provide new means of communication between each other. And there's some really interesting things happening if you interpret the evolution of the sort of technos, social space that we're operating in as a kind of communication in and of itself, not just the act of communication through it, but the creation of the thing as a media event, so to speak. And so, I'm going to pause to disambiguate between things that are sort of persistent and temporal, because one of the examples that isn't even the Wikipedia article is smoke signals, right? That is a means of communication here, or like Morse code or something that is like you have a communication event or even a telephone call or a spectacle or an event like a concert. There's these things that are expressions that happen kind of at once and they're gone. And that ephemerality has an effect on their meaning. But that doesn't make them any less media. On the other hand, we have more persistent things, movies, you have sort of semi-persistent things like emails. You kind of get the idea here, though, that there's a wide range all the way from, I mentioned the pyramids on one hand, monumental architecture in stone to, sort of these very transient events that occur in short periods of time and don't leave any particularly significant trace behind. I mean, maybe some metadata, but besides that, that's still just information about the thing. It's not the thing itself. And anyone who's attended a concert but then has something left over to say, hey, I was there, sort of understands this interesting relationship between the the communication of the thing that says I was there and the event itself that you were at. And honestly, I think we're already starting to see this mentality adopted when you see things like proof of attendance protocol tokens, where on one hand you can do a thing and the thing itself might have involved some communication or something meaningful in its own right, but then the extra piece of the artifact, so to speak, is actually a communication about a thing that was gone. And there's still a linkage between those. And so we're going to talk about media in the context of networks and people and events and things and how they relate to each other, so that we can better understand how to engage with them, how to understand what's happening around us, how to better participate in the creation of those new systems. So in networks, we describe everything in terms of vertices and edges, or nodes and links, or depending on your particular like vernacular, you might use these different terms, but ultimately you're just talking about sort of points and connections or pairings between points. And you can have richer descriptions, but for the basics of this, we might have multiple kinds of vertices or multiple kinds of nodes. We might have multiple kinds of edges, but ultimately we're just going to describe everything by saying, here's a type of node, here's a type of edge, here's an edge that connects two types of nodes. And that helps us understand a sort of just like a basic relational like ontology, like how things how the meaning of things interrelates. And so if I want to take this view, I could say all media is networked media, on the grounds that if media is communication, then we always have creators and consumers. So you have a blue dot for the one or more person involved in the creation of the media. Then you have the artifact or the event itself, and then you have the consumer, or the side that receives the communication. And this can happen in lots of different ways. And also, in particular, some relationships between media is latent. It's dependence. There's an explicit dependency or an implicit dependency, a citation, or even a literary allusion. And we'll touch on that briefly later. So a couple examples. We threw together, I don't say threw together. We wrote a paper on scaling the global commons based on DLT with a large group of co-authors. It's really fun to collaborate, but ultimately you could say that there's a group of co-authors who are together the creators, and then there's the artifact itself, the paper. It's a digital artifact. It doesn't really have it's not a physical instance of a paper, but it's something that will be sort of available in databases and whatnot in the future as a residual artifact of that creation event. And so we can see how this neighborhood of the media event emerges. Now, you can also think about the consumption side of this. Now, a collective consumption is just when lots of people consume the same piece. So actually, in this example, we could say, maybe I guess that's like 7 of us worked on this paper. And also there's some references to, the editors and people who actually helped review it. But ultimately, this thing becomes produced and goes to publication. And now anyone who finds that artifact in any of these platforms is a sort of collective consumer. Or even if it's not synchronous, it's still the consumption of the same artifact. Or another example, which is synchronous, is a radio broadcast. Or honestly, if we go back to our example of the pyramids, people have consumed that artifact, that piece of media for, I guess, millennia. And maybe they've had different experiences with it, but you could argue that in this graph, there was the people who produced it, and then the people who consumed it, numbering in, honestly, I don't even begin to know where to count on either side, considering the human power required to produce it and the number of years for which people have been traveling there to consume those works. But you kind of get the idea that we have these graph structures in theory, but then we can start to look at how they would fill in. And I like this. It's sort of a tongue-in-cheek quote that's attributed to Picasso that great artists steal, though this quote Investigator link is an attempt to verify whether that's true. I'm going to use this little example. I'm not sure if this will play through the presentation, but this is like a sample of a Girl Talk, which is a mashup band. And actually the thing I like about this video is that it actually shows the references as you go through it. These are the different things being sampled as you were to listen to it. And one of the nice things about looking at mashups as an example of compositions is that there tends to be, at least with popular ones, like analysis of what was composed. Less direct examples of this might be, I alluded to literary illusions, which is like when something in one book, for example, or a movie references a plot item or a character from another one without without directly citing it. You're just like building on the ideas or tapping into the consumer's knowledge of the other thing. And so that's another way in which the media itself can be directly related. It can also have technical dependencies where like one thing isn't possible without another. Anyway, the case may be actually a good example would be if there were a recording of this talk that itself is an artifact, but it's as a dependency the spectacle or the event of me giving the talk. It has as a dependency the artifact, which is this slide deck. And so you could see how this part of the artifact direct relations might exist. And then the real media networks end up being these messy webs of people and stuff. And really that's where we're going, is that these messy webs of people and stuff are not entirely visible, and the value of things is inherited from those networks, even if they're not very visible. So, someone might consider this a particularly valuable talk if they, I don't know, listen to it, get inspired, and go on to create some awesome software. Then maybe this talk is somewhere deep in the network that gave rise to that without ever really being all that important on its own. But some of its value could be inherited from the fact that it motivated, incentivized, or enabled someone to do something else. And we can see that the web ends up getting pretty messy, and it's not really clear what contributed to what directly, or I guess indirectly. We can kind of fill in the direct links insofar as we keep track of them. There's an entire sort of sub-discipline in library science related to bibliometrics and the idea that you could keep track of like at least scientific provenance of these kinds of interconnectedness, but I don't see it being that extensively applied to more general or collective or folk works. And so, when I say folk works, I really just mean stuff made by anybody. And it's true that a lot of that stuff is incredibly valuable, at least to the people who made it, and more often not eventually is a contributor to something else. And as higher order things emerge, there's kind of a tendency to attribute all the credit to like the last one or two people who contributed to it, when in reality, we really have these deep contribution networks that eventually give rise to, anything that has a meaningful impact on our lives. And that's not to say that the ends aren't, the end production isn't important, but that the very fact that the end production was important generally implies that it taps into something wider or more basic, which would imply that it's more deeply connected, at least at the consumer side, if not on the producer or creator side. And so I'm going to kind of steer towards the end of this talk by tying this into things like NFTs and, metadata and events. And so I like to point out that the sort of power of any particular media is what it communicates and to whom, and really under what circumstances. So if we look at something like this sort of recent, creation and the event of selling the Beeple 5,000 days, it's like there's a lot baked in there. For one, it's got a derivative references to all of the earlier pieces. It has the event of the sale itself, which was stewarded by an entity that has a role in sort of art auctions to begin with. There's a whole bunch of stuff mixed in with this. And it's really, I think for a lot of people, about communicating, the very notion of NFTs and the sort of the emergence of this sort of digital blockchain enforced art form. And you could almost argue that the value creation was as much in taking the existing pieces and composing them and sort of saying, and here is a new thing, and it exists in this, as a record on a blockchain that created its value, because all of the pieces already existed. So it was in a way the spectacle of the sale and the composition event that created the value, and it communicated something about the importance or relevance or value of these objects. On the other hand, on the other side of the slide, I have something like totally the opposite, like completely valueless NFTs to most people that come from my real life context. So like I had some meetings on the weekend, I hung out with some of the metagame folks, we played a vocal Pictionary game, and we like somebody drew a picture while we tried to sing the song they were drawing. Super fun. And as an event, it passed. The artifact itself is effectively a digital footprint of a memory, but it has value to me because I can associate it to that experience, and technically I could transfer it. Not sure that I would have any reason to, because why would anyone else value it more than I do? Because for me, it's a sticker of sorts, a representation of a memory. And on the other hand, I have this one that I'm minted for two of my friends who I had a meeting with, and we were discussing some NFTs and some guild stuff related to the Near platform, and we talked a little bit about networks, so you can see the little network drawing. But all it actually represented is that event happened, and I made it to make a point, which is that I think that it's very valuable to do proof of attendance protocol like things, but in a slightly richer way that contains not just the event itself, but possibly some relationship information about with whom and sort of maybe what other dependencies were there. And so, as a sort of toy experiment, I minted this, and I actually only minted 2 of them so far because one of the attendees has not sent me their address yet, at which point I will mint the 3rd one. Point being here is these don't have to be valuable or resold to actually fill their role in communicating, because they don't have to sell it to communicate something. It actually, even just seeing that it's present, if you were to go to zargham.eth and see that thing, it would still succeed in communicating something to you. Maybe very little because you weren't there and you don't know what the thing represents, but at minimum it represents or communicates something to me and to the other people who are present. Which sort of brings me to the end of my talk, which is a tie-in to this ongoing discussions around the meta pubs and meta skills, and this idea that we're actually trying to do something a bit like cartography in cyberspace. If we say that cyberspace is, in a sense, the space made up of all of this media and all of these actions, and including the economic communications, then we could interpret what we're doing when we start to build data structures and create standards and find these minimalist, sort of not overly expressive things. They're just enough to build the graph. And then all of the other details are context specific. So, in this example, I almost always include some sort of extra structure for something like an IPFS CID, because the idea is that all the rest of the details are not required by the standard, right? The standard just says it's a thing, any artifact, or even arguably any reference to an event, which might require an artifact that describes the event, but even that artifact is just a reference, a communication about the thing that happened that was transitory or ephemeral. And so, we're exploring these standards. Anyone who's interested in kind of playing at this with us or going on this quest would be just sort of interested in coming and joining this HackMD. There's links to it in the metagame forum, I believe, under the meta pubs and meta skills proto-spec threads, but we largely moved it out of the forums into a little bit of co-hacking, little discussions here and there of POCs. And personally, I think the challenge here is to make something that is useful for everyone, that hence standard. So rather than making a whole new project or a new DAO or a new anything, we're just basically saying, come hang out, talk sometimes in the Telegram channel or in the metagame Discord, or hack and add edits or comments into the HackMD. And I'm talking to one of my friends who's at Protocol Labs about possibly making some POCs of some simple meme games. We're still exploring the right way to get that done, but it doesn't really matter who builds POCs, because the whole point of the standard setting is that you should be able to implement these things all the way from basically raw Solidity contracts all the way to sort of baking them into some more advanced platforms that are doing any number of different kinds of publications, because the idea is that if we follow some really basic data structure conventions, you can piece these graphs back together by thinking of them as sort of metadata of the network. So in a sense, you would have a unique address associated with the artifacts. And of course, we already have addresses associated with people, in particular, things like the proof of attendance protocol tokens defining past events, and even like ENS, right? Like people who are starting to identify certain addresses to their identity by choice are essentially creating the blue nodes in these media networks. And they can both produce and consume things depending on how they engage with that system. So that's the kind of invitation. It's been a pretty informal quest thus far. Basically, people just hack on it on their own terms and then report their learnings. And if they want to edit the HackMD, they do it. And my hope is that we can sort of emerge a better understanding of networked media and actually manifest it so that we can crawl those graphs and actually see, trace back the origins of some of the things that we find really valuable, and even maybe, better appreciate the sort of idea, I guess, that even culture can be thought of as a public good, and it doesn't have to be monetized directly, meaning you sold it, for it to be valued. And sometimes the trick to getting people to value things is to get people to see things, and then you can worry about whether someone pays for it or not later. You can just start with, well, you can't really value something until you know that it's there. So with that, I will say thank you, and I guess I only left 5 minutes for Q&A. Sorry about that, but at least some.
No sorries. I think it's good. It just means that you talked through all the possible questions and answered them already. And I think that what you're saying here at the end, it ties in a little bit to what MetaDreamer and Drew were talking about making your NFT CV be your avatar in crypto boxes or something. Be like, this is my identity. This is who I am. This is what I showed up to. These are the steps that I took to participate in this ecosystem. And I like the idea of thinking of it like a map of where you've been, a map of what you're contributing.
And where you might go. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about this is it's a map of a territory that we're creating. So in a sense, once you start to see the map, you can also start to think about what's not mapped yet, but also how you might manifest that or bring it into existence. And I think this is one of the tricky things. Is there's a tendency for people to think about what they can log about the past in a sense, but once you can start to do that, you can actually think more about what you could do to create the future you want, because you can envision what the graph would look like in your ideal world, and then find other people who feel similarly and then collaborate to actually produce those artifacts.
Definitely. And I think it ties into with metagame figuring out skill trees and using NFTs along the way, possibly for that, to lead you in directions, to pick up new skills, to connect with the experts. And Deep Work works alongside too of Metagame as an embassy, and they have a pretty good structure going on for their skill trees. And yeah, I think this is like the new resume, in a sense, like, but much more than that too,
It's relevant in both so I had given some talks in the past, one at the Blockchain for Science conference in Berlin, like maybe 2 years ago. And I was talking about a lot of these same concepts from the perspective of science, and the need for these kinds of attribution networks to help sort of tease out the productive work from what often becomes this highly over-metricized, produce more citations versus the sort of underlying value created through the sort of exercise of scientific processes, creative processes. And I think it holds doubly true for sort of culture and art and anything that you're producing who, may only have its value through its, through what it communicates, through how people engage with it or feel about it. And that, otherwise you kind of collapse into this sense that well, sort of, I guess there's a whole art theory track one could go into to sort of reason about, modernism and postmodernism and meaning and blah, blah, blah. But the nuts and bolts of it for me is that I have engaged in sponsoring, in producing and consuming art. And all that really matters for me is ultimately how that, what that art communicates to me and what I would be attempting to communicate through the sponsoring or participation of those pieces. And, once you sort of recognize it as communication, then you could say that it's literally in the eye of the creator and the eye of beholder. And those are just two different perspectives on the same object. And as long as one or both of those things is valuable to you, then you should that should be discoverable or that should be identifiable. Doesn't mean everyone has to agree. It just means like you have a big graph of people who thought it mattered enough to produce it and people who thought it mattered enough to consume it, and whether they thought the same thing is actually lost because you're just looking at those as different edges in the same graph.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a more transparent way to, I don't know, put your money where your mouth is, in a sense. We go through the current capitalistic system and maybe buy stuff that we don't actually need or want, but you're repping it, and this is like I don't know, this is correcting that from the get-go, in a sense.
Yeah, and I think we're building the tools to make this a little bit more foundational. I think one of the reasons why I talk about this in a context like metagame, even though I've been working on network science for longer than there have been blockchains, is that suddenly now we start to see people instantiating new socio-technical infrastructure that's capable of being designed with these things in mind from the beginning. Rather than trying to like paste them on after the fact, we can just say like, this is foundational stuff. And insofar as we have standards and norms around respecting this stuff, then it can just be baked in, and maybe people don't have to think about it because it's literally baked into the way our stuff works. When it's not baked into how our stuff works, then it's either ignored or we have to think about it a lot.
Right. Well, you definitely left me with a mind full of questions that I'm going to have to follow up on. And I think that we're gonna bounce back to Pete, who's still in his basement going through the slides that he was going through earlier.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Bye-bye.